Okay, perfect time for a nice little internet hiccup. Sorry about that. We're back, I think. Yes, we're back. Okay, good. Just, just good. Please, I don't need any more difficulty. All right, microstar. He'd been out of circulation too long. He was losing his edge. How else to explain an ambush at the hands of three glassy-eyed children on the back streets of Santa Cruz? Of course, Lubin had had a lot on his mind. He was coming to terms with some very disturbing test results, for one thing. He'd been pursuing them for days, rejecting each new clean bill of health, running increasingly specific tests for increasingly implausible maladies. And now, finally, there it was. Something in his blood that neither nature nor Enempach had put there. Something strangely backward. More than sufficient to distract any normal man, perhaps. No excuse for someone who'd once transplanted a micronuke from his own gut into the heart of the Trois Rivières switching station without benefits of anesthesia. No excuse for Ken Lubin. It was inexcusable. His assailants barely even qualified as punks, ranging in age from perhaps 16 to 20, pumped on some sort of neurotrope, evidently convinced that their transderm steroids and corneal caps and shock prods made them invulnerable. Sometime during Lubin's Pacific tour, the Rifter template had become fashionable among drybacks. It was probably the eyes more than anything. Back on the seabed, ICAPs had hidden a multitude of sins, kept fear and weakness and hatred safely concealed behind masks of blank indifference. Down there, the caps had provided cover, imposed enough protective distance for weak people to become strong, given time. Up here, though, they only seemed to make weak people stupid. Up here, though, they only seemed to make weak people stupid. They wanted money, or something. He wasn't really paying attention. He didn't even bother warning them off. They didn't seem in the mood to listen. 5 seconds later, they weren't in the mood to do anything but run. Lubin, having foreseen this on some level long since relegated to subconsciousness, had deprived them of the use of their legs. He felt a token distracted reluctance at the necessary next step. They had, after all, seen more of his abilities than good security would dictate. It had been his own damn fault. If he hadn't been so careless, he'd have avoided the situation altogether. But the damage was done. Loose ends were fraying, and had to be cut. There were no witnesses. The children had chosen wisely in that regard, at least. There were no screams, only quiet gasps and the soft pop of dislocating vertebrae. No ineffective get pleas for mercy. Only one of them even tried to speak, perhaps emboldened by the realization that somehow, incredibly, in the space of barely a minute, she had reached the point of having nothing left to lose. Mange de la merde, enculé, she croaked as Lubin reached down. Who the fuck died and made you Lenny Clark? Lubin blinked. What? The child spat blood in his face and stared defiantly back with featureless white eyes. Well, Lubin thought, maybe there would have been hope for you after all. And twisted. It was a bit disturbing, of course. He'd had no idea that Lenny Clark was famous. He asked the matchmakers for references to Lenny Clark. Maelstrom hiccoughed and advised him to narrow his search criteria. There were over 50 million hits. He started exploring. Lenny Clark was an anarchist. Lenny Clark was a liberator. Lenny Clark was a fashion symbol. Lenny Clark was an avenging angel, resurrected from the ocean depths to tear down the system that had abused and victimized her. Lenny Clark had followers, mostly in Enempach so far, but the word was spreading. Hordes of disaffected, powerless people had found someone to relate to, a fellow victim with impervious eyes who had learned to fight back. Against what, exactly, there was no consensus. With whose army, not a whisper. Lenny Clark was a mermaid. Lenny Clark was a myth. Lenny Clark is dead, Lubin reminded himself. None of the references he could find would confirm that fact. Perhaps she'd made it after all. The GA had promised a shuttle to evacuate BB. Lubin had assumed, along with everyone else, that they'd been lying. Clark had been the only one to stay behind and find out. Maybe all of them made it. Maybe something happened after I got separated. He entered separate queries. Alice Nakata, Michael Brander, Judy Karako, just to be thorough. Maelstrom knew of many of those. Maelstrom knew of many by those names, but none seemed to have the cachet of Lenny Clark. He fed the same list through Haven. The results were smoother, the data much higher in quality, but the bottom line remained unchanged. Just Lenny Clark. Something with that name was infecting the world. Lenny Clark is alive, said a voice in his ear. He recognized it. One of the generic disembodied matchmakers that came out of Haven in answer to user questions. Lubin glanced across his display, puzzled. He hadn't entered any queries. It is almost certain, the voice continued, distant and inflectionless, almost as though it were talking to itself. Lenny Clark lives. Temperature and salinity are well within acceptable ranges. It paused. You are Kenneth Lubin. You are alive as well. He disconnected. Anonymity. That was the whole point of the exercise. Lubin knew the specs on Ridley and on similar facilities distributed invisibly throughout the world. They didn't scan eyes or faces. They only cared that entrance could do no harm. Everyone was equal within the frosted glass tubes of the 14th floor. Everyone was no one. Yet someone in Haven had called him by name. He left Santa Cruz. There was another secure gateway at the Packard Tower in Monterey. This time, Lubin wasn't taking any chances. He linked to his terminal through 3 separate watches connected in series, each scrambled on a different seed. He restarted a search on Lenny Clark, carefully following different query trees than he had the first time. Lenny Clark is on the move, a far-off voice mused. Lubin started a trace. Kenneth Lubin has been sighted in Sevastopol, the voice remarked. Recent reports have also placed it in the White Horse and Philadelphia sometime within the past 84 hours. Lenny and Lubin are on the comeback trail. Are you a fan of alliteration? This is very strange, he thought. We are looking out for Kenny and Lenny, the voice continued. We intend on translocating and disseminating both parties into novel environments with acceptable salinity range varies directly with temperature within the environments considered. Do you relate to rhyme? It's a neural net, he realized. A Turing app. Maybe a gel. Whatever was talking to him, it wasn't programmed. It had learned to speak through trial and error, had worked out its own rules of grammar and syntax. Lubin had seen such devices, or organisms, or whatever they were, demonstrated. They picked up the rules easily enough, but they always seemed to throw in a few stylistic quirks of their own. It was hard to track down exactly how that happened. The logic evolved, synapse by synapse. It was opaque to conventional analysis. No, he said experimentally. For one, I don't relate to rhyme, although that's not true all the time. A brief silence. Then, excellent. I would have paid, you know. Mediocre at best. What are you? I am telling you about Lenny and Kenny. You don't want to fuck with them, friend. You want to know what side you're on, right? Tell me then. Nothing. Hello? Nothing. To make things worse, his trace failed. Return address blocked its source. He waited for a good 5 minutes in case the voice started talking again. It didn't. Lubin disconnected from his terminal, logged in on a different one farther along the row. This time he left Lenny Clark and Ken Lubin strictly alone. Instead, he stored the results of his worrisome blood tests in an open file, tagged to certain keywords that would hopefully attract attention from the right sources. Someone out there was paralleling his investigation. It was time to lure them in. He logged off, distracted by an obvious and uncomfortable coincidence. A smart gel had been running the nuke that vaporized BB's station. Matchmaker. Prions, okay. Viruses, adeno, okay. Arbo, okay. Arena, okay. Philo, Ben, Morbili, Cron Asymp, Orbi, okay. Parami, Cron/Asymp. Parvo, okay. Picorna, okay. Hanta, residual. Retro, residual. Rota, light. Bacteria. Bacillus, heavy, normal. Coccus, normal. Myco/Spiro, STD mod. Clam, okay. Fungi, not critical. Protozoa, not critical. Nematode, okay. Platyhelminth, okay. Cestode, okay. Arthropod, okay. Cleared for travel. Are you sure? No ergots or psychoactives? Cleared for travel. Please proceed to check-in. Are you equipped for NMR? This booth is designed to scan for communicable parasites and diseases. You may visit a commercial med booth if you wish to be tested for other disorders. Where's the nearest commercial med booth, then? Please don't leave me. What? Stay, Lenny. We can work it out. Besides, there's someone you should meet. The screen went dark. The bead in her ear emitted a tiny belch of static. It's me, said a sudden voice. Suhan, from the bus station. She grabbed her visor and fled into the tame green jungle of Concourse D. Startled pedestrian eyes, barely noticed, met her own. She slid the visor onto her face, not slowing. You don't understand. The voice was a small, pleading thing in her ear. I'm on your side. Glass doors leading outside. Clark pushed through. Sudden icy wind reduced global warming to a weak abstraction. The concourse arced around from behind her like a horseshoe-shaped canyon. I'm here to help! Clark tapped her watch twice in succession. Command mode, the device replied. Off, she told it. Amitab's dick! Off, the watch acknowledged, and instantly fell asleep. She was alone. The sidewalk was empty. Light spilled from the warren of habit trail tubes. Light spilled from the warren of habit rail tubes that shielded McCall's patrons from winter. The whine of distant turbines drifted down from the rooftops. 2 taps. On. A soft fuzz of static from the earpiece, although her watch was well within its operational 2-meter radius. Are you there? She said. Yes. What about Amitav? Just before it, I mean, the voice caught on itself. They just burned everything. Everyone. He must have been. A passing gust of wind snapped at her face. The mermaid took a bitterly cold breath. I'm sorry, the stranger whispered in her head. Clark turned and went back inside. Heat death. It was an impoverished display, sparse informatics against a dark background. Lats and longs, a tiny GPS overlay centered on Calgary International Airport, a no visual icon blinking the obvious at 2-second intervals. How do you know? Breathed a disembodied voice in Perot's ear. I saw it. The start of it, anyway. Hard-edged airport ambiance echoed in the background. Ooh, sorry. Ooh. Hard-edged airport ambiance echoed in the background. I'm sorry. It was his own fault, Clark said after a moment. He made too much noise. He was just asking for it. I don't think that was it, Perot said. They slagged 8 whole kilometers. What? Some kind of biohazard, I think. Amitov just got caught in the sweep. No. Words so soft they were almost static. Can't be. I'm sorry. No visual. No visual. Who are you? Clark asked at last. I ride botflies, Perot said. Mop-ups mainly. I saw you when you came out of the ocean. I saw how you affected the people on the strip. I saw you when you had one of those visions. Aren't you the faithful little stalker? Clark said. That wasn't me, she continued after a while. Back on the strip. That was Amitov. He ran with it. You were the It wasn't me. Okay, fine. No visual. Why are you following me? Clark said. Someone's linked us up. And at the bus station earlier. Who? I don't know. Probably one of your friends. Something between a cough and a laugh. I don't think so. Perot took a breath. You're getting known, you know. People are noticing. Some of them must be protecting you. From what exactly? I don't know. Maybe from the people who started the quake. What do you know about that? Clark's voice almost pounced down the link. Millions died, Perot said. You know why. You know why. That makes you dangerous to all the wrong people. Is that what you think? It's one of the rumors. I don't know. Don't know much, do you? I. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I want or what I've. You don't know who they are or what they want. You just sit there and let them use you. What do you want? What do you want? None of your fucking business. Perot shook her head. I'm just trying to help, you know. Lady, I don't know if you even exist. For all I know, that kid in South Bend is playing some kind of sick joke. Something's happening because of you. Something real. You can check the threads yourself if you don't believe me. You're some kind of catalyst, whether you know it or not. And here you are, jumping in with no questions asked. I've got questions. No answers, then. I could be planting bombs. I could be spit roasting babies. You don't know, but here you are with your tongue hanging out anyway. Listen, Perot snapped. Whatever you're doing, it can't be any worse than the way things are already. She stopped, astonished at the thought, grateful that she'd kept it back. She felt an absurd certainty that 700 kilometers away, Lenny Clark was smiling. She tried again. Look, I may not know what's going on, but I know something is, and it revolves around you. And I bet that not everyone who knows that is on your side. Maybe you think I'm a head case. Fine. But even I wouldn't risk going through airport security with the kind of profile your implants put out. I'd get out now, and I'd forget about flying anywhere for the foreseeable future. There are other ways to get around. She waited. Tactical constellations glimmered about her. Okay, Clark said at last. Thanks for the tip. Here's one for you. Stop trying to help me. Help whoever's trying to stamp me out, if you can find them. For God's sake, why? For your own sake, Susie. For everyone you ever cared about. Amitov was... He didn't deserve what happened to him. No, of course he didn't. 8 kilometers, you said? Yes, burned to bedrock. I think that was just the beginning, Clark said. Off. Around Suhan Perot, the stars went out. Blind date. Interested? Reply. It was an odd sort of caption to find on a biochemical graphic. A lopsided crucifix of carbons and oxygens and hydrogens. Oh, wait, there was a sulfur over there, and a nitrogen on one side of the crossbeam, right about where they'd nailed Jesus' wrist into place. Of course, the way this thing was built, the Savior's left arm would have to be about twice as long as his right. Methionine, methionine, the matchmaker said. An amino acid. Only flipped. A mirror image. Interested? Fucking right. The file had been sitting in his morning behemoth-related data sweep, ticking quietly. He hadn't even had time to check it out until several hours into his shift. Supercall was burning a path through Glasgow, and some new carbon-eating bug, mutant or construct, nobody knew, had eaten a big chunk of the bicentennial causeway right out from under a few thousand Rapitrans passengers. It had been a busy morning, but finally he'd had a few moments to come down off the accelerants and breathe. He'd opened the file, and it had jumped out as if spring-loaded. The matchmaker was unusually forthcoming in explaining why this file qualified for his attention. Usually, matchmakers delivered their treasures through logical chains way too twisted for humans to follow. Like magic, needed information from all over the world would simply appear in your queue, unsummoned. But this file, this had come with explicit search terms attached, terms that even a human being could understand. Quarantine, firestorm, BB station, Channer vent. Interested? Not enough information to be useful. Just enough to catch the attention of someone like him. Not data at all, really. Bait. Reply. Thanks for dropping in. Canned voice, no graphic. Desjardins flipped his own voice filter on. Got your message. What can I do for you? We have a mutual interest in biochemistry, the voice said pleasantly. I have information you might find useful. The reverse may also be true. And who are you exactly? I'm someone who shares your interest in biochemistry, and who has information you might find useful. Actually, Desjardins remarked, you're a secretarial app. Pretty basic one, too. Nothing disagreed. Okay, then, pocket whatever you've got and tag it the same way you tagged your invite. I'll pick it up on my next sweep and get back to you. Sorry, said the app. That doesn't work from this end. Of course not. So what would work for you? I'd like to meet. Fine. Name a time, I'll clear a channel. Face to face. Well, You mean in person? Yes. What for? I'm suspicious by nature. I don't trust digital images. I can be at your location within 48 hours. Do you know my location? No. If I wasn't also suspicious by nature, I sure as shit would be now, Desjardins said. Then an interest in biochemistry is not all we have in common. Desjardins hated it when apps did that, threw in little asides and lame witticisms to appear more human. Of course, Desjardins hated it when people did that too. If you'd like to choose a place and time we could meet, the app told him, I'll be sure to show up. How do you know when I'm not How do you know I'm not quarantined? For that matter, how do I know you're not? What am I getting into here? That won't be a problem. What are you really? Some kind of loyalty test Rowan's sicking on me? I don't understand. Because it's really not necessary. A corpse of all people should know that. Whoever the app was negotiating for had to be corpse level at least, to be so confident about travel clearances. Unless the whole thing was some kind of pointless and elaborate put on. I'm not administering a loyalty test, the app replied. I'm asking for a date. Okay then. Pickering's Pile. Drink and Drug in Sudbury, Ontario. Wednesday, 1930. That will be fine. How will I know you? Not so fast. I think I'd rather approach you. That would be a problem. That is a problem. If you think I'm going to amble innocently into the clutches of someone who won't even give me their name, you're sadly in need of a patch. I'm sorry to hear that. However, it doesn't matter. We can still meet. Not if neither of us knows how to tag the other, we can't. I'll see you on Wednesday, the app told him. Goodbye. Wait a second. Gone. Oh, man. Someone was going to meet him on Wednesday. Someone who evidently could drop down onto any place under geosync in 48 hours' notice. At 48 hours' notice. Someone who knew of a link between Channervent and Behemoth, and who seemed to think they could find him without any identifiers at all. Someone was going to meet him, whether he wanted to or not. Achilles Desjardins found that a little bit ominous. Necrosis. There were places in the world that lived on the arteries between here and there. Whatever they generated within wasn't self-sustaining. When tourniqueted, a quarantine, a poisoned water table, the sheer indifference of citizens abandoning some industrial lost cause, they withered and turned gangrenous. Sometimes, eventually, the walls would come down. The quarantine would end or atrophy. Gates would open or just rust away. But by then it was too late. The tissue was long since necrotic. No new blood flowed into the dead zone. Maybe a few intermittent flickers along underground cables, peripheral nerves where Maelstrom jumped the gap. Maybe a few people who hadn't gotten out in time, still alive. Others arriving, not so much seeking this place as avoiding some other. Lenny Clark was in such a place now, a town full of wreckage and smashed windows and hollowed eyes, staring from buildings nobody had bothered to condemn. Whatever life was here did not, for the most part, take any notice of her passing. She avoided the obvious territorial boundaries. The toothless skulls of children significantly arranged along a particular curb, a half-mummified corpse crucified upside down beneath the cryptic phrase, Saint Peter the Unworthy. Derelict vehicles that just happened to block this road or that, rusty barricades, herding the unwary toward some central slaughterhouse like fish in a weir. 2 days before, she'd skirted a coven of do-gooders who'd been live-trapping derelicts as though they were field mice, forcibly injecting them with some kind of gene cocktail. Xanthoplast recipes, probably. Since then, she'd managed to avoid seeing anyone. She moved only at night, when her marvelous eyes gave her every advantage. She steered clear of the local headquarters and territorial checkpoints with their burning oil drums and their light poles and their corroded semi-functional ballard stacks. There were traps and hidden guard posts, manned by wannabes eager to make their way up the local hierarchy. They seeped slight infrared, or slivers of light invisible to mere meat. Lenny Clark noted them a block away and changed course, their attendants never the wiser. She was almost through the zone when someone stepped from a doorway 10 meters ahead of her. A mongrel with dominant Latino genes, skin the color of slate in the washed-out light boosted through her eye caps. Bare feet, shreds of sprayed-on plastic peeling from the soles. A firearm of some kind in one hand, 2 fingers missing. The other hand had... Oh my gosh, I am losing my mind. The other hand had been transformed into an improvised prosthetic, wrapped around and around in layers of duct tape studded with broken glass and rusty nails. He looked directly at her with eyes that shone as white and empty as her own. Well, well, there is no question there. Well, Clark said after a moment. His clubbed limb gestured roughly at the surrounding territory. Not much, but mine. His voice was hoarse with old diseases. There's a toll. I'll go back the way I came. No, you won't. She casually tapped a finger against her wristwatch. She kept her voice low, almost subvocal. Shadow. Funds transferred, the device replied. Clark sighed and sloughed off her pack. One corner of her mouth curled the slightest fraction. So, how do you want me? She asked. So, fair warning. You know that warning I keep putting up with nastiness happening? This is some nastiness. This is not the only nasty bit that we're going to have, but it's one of the nastier ones. Yay. Oh boy. So if this doesn't get it booted, nothing will. That means I'll be able to do... Ooh, there's a bunch of books I'll be able to get away with if I can get away with this. This is extremely unpleasant. So, for about the next 5 minutes, if you don't like graphic depictions of horrible things being done to people, well, and the discussion thereof, well, I'm sorry. You may want to mute this. It's pretty bad. He wanted her from behind, and he wanted her face in the dirt. He wanted to call her bitch and cunt and stumpfuck. He wanted to cut her with his home-built mace. She wondered if this could be called rape. She hadn't been offered a choice. Then again, she hadn't exactly said no, either. He hit her when he came, backhanded her head against the ground with his gun hand, but the gesture had an air of formality about it. Finally, he rolled off of her and stood. She allowed herself back inside then, let the distant observation of her own flesh revert again to first-hand experience. So, she rolled onto her back, wiping the street from her mouth with the back of one hand. How was I? He grunted and turned his attention to her pack. Nothing you want in there, she said. Uh-huh. Something caught his eye anyway. He reached in and pulled out a tunic of black, shimmering fabric. It squirmed in his hand. Shit! He dropped it onto the ground. It lay there, inert, playing dead. What the fuck? He looked at Clark. Party clothes, she said, getting to her feet. Wouldn't fit you. Bullshit, the mongrel said. It's that reflex copolymer stuff, like Lenny Clark wears. She blinked. What did you say? Leonard Clark, Deep Sea Gilman. Did the quake. He nudged the dive skin with one gnarled toe. You think I don't know? He raised his gun hand to his face. The barrel touched the corner of an eye cap. How you think I got these, eh? Not the first groupie in town. Leonard Clark? I said already. You deaf or stupid? I just let you rape me, asshole, so probably stupid. The mongrel looked at her for an endless moment. You've done this before, he said at last. More times than you can count. Get to maybe like it after a while? No. You didn't fight? Yeah? How many do with a gun to their heads? You're not even scared. I'm too fucking tired. You gonna let me go or kill me or what? Anything but listening to more of this shit. The mongrel took a hulking step forward. Lenny Clark only snorted. Go, the mongrel said in a strange voice, then added, absurdly, Where you headed? She arched an eyebrow. East. He shook his head. Never get through. Big quarantine. Goes halfway down to the Dust Belt. He pointed south, down a side street. Better go round. Clark tapped her watch. It's not listed. Then don't, fucklot, I care. Keeping her eyes up, Clark bent down and picked up her tunic. The mongrel held her pack out by the straps, glancing down into its depths. He tensed. Her hand lunged into the pack like a striking snake, snatched out the billy. She held it underhand, pointed at his gut. He stepped back, one hand still gripping the pack. His eyes narrowed to opalescent slits. Why didn't you use it? Didn't want to waste a charge. You're not worth it. He eyed the empty sheath on her leg. Why not keep it there? Where you can get it? Now, if you'd had a kid with you... They regarded each other through eyes that saw everything in black and white. You let me? The mongrel shook his head. The contradiction almost seemed painful. You had that, and you let me anyway. My pack, Clark said. You set me up. Dawning anger in that voice, and thick wonder. Maybe I just like it rough. You're contagious. You're a bug humper. She wiggled the baton. Give me my things, and maybe you'll live long enough to find out. You stump fuck. But he held out the pack. For the first time, she saw the webbing between the three stumpy digits of his hand, noticed the smooth, scarless tips of the stubs. Not violence, then. No street fight amputation. Born to it. You a farm baby? She asked. Maybe he was older than he looked. The farms hadn't deliberately spread buggy genotypes for decades. Sure, defectives spent more than healthy people on fixes, but the global ambiance was twisting babies into strange enough shapes on its own by then, without the risk of consumer backlash. You are, aren't you? He glared at her, shaking with helpless fury. Good, she said, grabbing her pack. Serves you fucking right. I'd have skipped that chapter entirely, but it kind of sets the tone for what Lenny Clark is now up to. so it's kind of important, horrible as it is. Snare. The voice in Lubin's ear had lied. He hadn't been outside Enumpak since landfall. He hadn't been in Sevastopol or Philadelphia for years. He'd never been in Whitehorse, and from what he knew of the place, he hoped he never would be. But he could have been. The lie was a plausible one, to someone who knew Lubin but not his current circumstances. Or maybe it hadn't been a deliberate lie. Maybe it had been a flawed guess, based on God knew what irrelevant stats. Maybe it had just been a bunch of random words shoveled together with more regard for grammar than veracity. He wondered if he might have started the rumor himself. Before he left for Sudbury, he put that hypothesis to the test. He logged back into Haven and began a new name search. Judy Catterco, Lenny Clark, Alice Nakata, and Kenneth Lubin. It was a different voice that accosted him this time. It spoke in soft, gentle tones, almost whispering. It showed no predilection for alliteration or nonsense rhyme. It tended to mispronounce hard consonants. It called him Michael. As in Brander, one presumes. He suborbed to Toro Milton, took a shuttle north from that city-state. Endless suburbs kept pace beneath him, spilling far from the megapolitan hub that had once kept them captive. The daily commute had ended decades before, and still the blight was spreading. The outside world passed uneventfully. There were only a few restricted zones in all of Ontario, and none were on his route. The world inside was a bit more interesting. Deep in the seething chaos that was Maelstrom, rumors of Mike Brander's resurrection were beginning to sprout alongside tales of Lubin's own. Mike Brander had been seen in Los Angeles. Mike Brander had been seen in Lima. Lubin frowned, a small expression of self-disgust. He'd given himself away with his own questions. Something in Haven had taken notice when he'd run searches on all BB crew members except himself. And why doesn't this user ask about Lubin, space K? Because this user must already know about Lubin, space K. Because this user is Lubin, space K. Lenny and Kenny are on the comeback trail. His last stroll through Haven, asking about everyone except Mike Brander, had provoked the same attention and the same simple logic. Now Mike Brander was alive and well and living in Maelstrom. QED. What's doing this? Why? Why didn't always enter into it, of course. Sometimes Maelstrom's wildlife would just grab onto popular threads to get around, steal keywords to blend in, sneak through filters by posing as part of the herd. Classic bandwagon effect, blind and stupid as evolution itself. That was why such strategies always fizzled after a while. The fad of the moment would fade into obscurity, leaving leaving poseurs with forged tickets to an empty ballroom. Or the gatekeepers would catch on. The more popular the disguise, the greater the incentive for countermeasures. Wildlife would hitch a ride on existing rumors, if they were hot enough. Lubin had never heard of them starting rumors of their own before. And why Lenny Clark? An obscure life, an invisible death. Hardly the most contagious meme in the wires. Nothing to inspire any post-mortem legacy at all, in fact. This was something new. Whatever it was goal-directed, and it was using Lenny Clark. More than that, now it was using him. Sudbury had arrived DOA in the 21st century. Decades of mining and a substrate of thin, poorly buffered soil had seen to that. The Sudbury Stacks had been the epicenter for one of the first really big acid blights in North American history. It was a benchmark of sorts. Not that this was entirely a bad thing. Legend had it that lunar astronauts had once practiced in its scoured gray environs, and the area's lakes were truly beautiful, clear and blue and lifeless as chemically treated toilet bowls. The substrate was relentlessly stable, planed and leveled by long vanished glaciers. The west coast could fall into the ocean, but the Canadian Shield would last forever. Exotic alien life forms would disembark from tankers or lifters at the industrial horseshoe around Lake Ontario, wreak local havoc as they always had, but you'd have to be one tough chimera to get past the acid-washed outskirts of Sudbury, Ontario. Its dead zone was like a moat, a firebreak burned into the countryside by 100 years' worth of industrial poison. It couldn't have suited Xira better if it had been planned. Here was a place resistant to the calamities that threatened the rest of the world, by virtue of having already lost anything of real value. The real estate was cheap, too. The nickel mine was long exhausted, and there'd been a vacuum in the local economy since the last of the fuel rods had been buried over in Copper Cliff. The Entropy Patrol had filled that vacuum. The Sudbury office was one of the hemisphere's top 10. It was no surprise to Ken Lubin that his quarry was stationed there. That mysterious searcher hadn't seemed to know the specifics of what he or she was after. The caches left behind in Haven had jumped fastest when queried on ecological impacts and sheer correlative epidemiology, slowest when asked about subcellular organelles or biochemical pathways. Not the spoor of someone following an intimately known agent. More likely, someone tracking a new and mysterious one. Not a farm, then. Someone with a more ecological perspective, and with, given their access to Haven, a great deal of clearance and autonomy. The Entropy Patrol had the only talent pool that fit. One good thing about the patrol was that it was appropriately paranoid on matters of access. In a world dominated by the telecommute, lawbreakers dutifully made the daily, real-world journey into a single, vast, secure catacomb that plugged directly into Haven. Nobody would have been stupid enough to try and manage an entropy outbreak from a home terminal, even if it had been possible. At Xira, even the links into Maelstrom were insanely secure, which made tracking down employees quite straightforward. They all had to come through the foyer. There was no listing of individual lawbreakers, of course. There was a listing of department heads, available through a small orchard of help kiosks in the main lobby. Once Lubin had what he needed, he stepped outside and headed to the nearest rapid trans stop. Donald Lertzman was the archetypal middleman. His career had coasted to that comfortable plateau above those who actually did productive work, but safely short of a position where he had to make any vital decisions. Perhaps on some level he'd realized that. Perhaps a fully detached house, hidden behind a hedgerow of acid-resistant blue spruce at the edge of the Sudbury Burn, was his way of compensating. Of course, in this day and age, he could hardly commute in his private vehicle. He knew the value of appearances. He'd built his livelihood on nothing else. Each night, therefore, he traversed the 3 blocks between his property and the nearest bus stop on foot. Approximately 20% of this distance was out of public view. "Excuse me, are you Donald Lertzman?" "Yes, who?" Lubin carefully noted the medic alert plug-in on Lertzman's wristwatch. It would raise the alarm if his vitals showed any indication of ongoing distress. Of course, a body's stress responses don't just kick in by themselves. They have to be activated by the perception of threat or injury. Most of those signals run through the spinal cord. 10 minutes after failing to introduce himself, Lubin knew who he was looking for. He knew where to find him. He knew when that person's shift ended. He knew more than he needed for the moment. His scheduled meeting at Pickering's pile was 26 hours away. Lubin didn't know if he wanted to wait that long. For that matter, there was no guarantee that this Achilles Desjardins would even show up. He left Donald Lertzman breathing peacefully. Complicity. It was every bit as abrupt this time. The sudden translocation of place, one world annihilated, another created in its stead. There may have been some warning, a barely perceptible stutter in the feeds, a ping as if something far away was checking for activity on the line. But it came too fast to serve as any kind of heads up, even if Perot hadn't simply imagined it. It didn't matter. She was waiting. She'd been waiting for days. The same God's eye view. A different multitude spread out below, framed by familiar icons and overlays. She'd been shunted from one botfly to another. Nav and GPS were dark for some reason. But she was indoors, and there was violence. Oh, but she was indoors, and there was violence. One man lay twisted on the concrete floor. Another's boot caught him in the stomach as she watched. His body folded weakly around the blow in some impotent fetal reflex, smearing blood and teeth in its wake. The face was too torn and bloody to betray any clear ethnicity. The assailant, smaller, black, his back to the camera, shifted his weight from side to side with a terrible, restless energy. His arena was defined by the crowd that enclosed it, some intent, some indifferent, some shaking their own fists in frenzied enthusiasm. Farther away, the concentration of humanity thinned out, gave way to sleeping mats and forgotten piles of personal belongings. Perot spun through the available menus. No weapons. In the corner of her eye, a flashing distraction. Target minus 162 degrees as, minus 41 degrees deck. Behind her. The victor circled, still bobbing. His face came into view, creased in a fury of concentration. His foot lashed out again, a kidney blow to the back. The twitching thing on the floor jerked open like a bloody flower. Its back arched as though electrocuted. The attacker looked up, straight at Perot's hijacked botfly. His eyes were the brilliant crystalline jade of engineered chlorophyll. They stared from that black face like a hallucination. Without taking his eyes off the fly, he delivered one last kick at the head of his victim. Then he moved into the crowd, unopposed. Suhan Perot had never seen him before. She didn't know his victim. But target was at minus 175 degrees as, minus 40 degrees deck, and moving. Pan left. More people, more sleeping mats. Gray, unfinished walls rising in the distance, lined with vending machines, and, higher up, official pictographs directing the populace to registration and quarantine and latest bulletins. They were in a cement cave 10 meters high, erected in the name of mass subsistence. A place for quarantines, an inoculation center, a shelter against those sudden bouts of weather too vicious for the ad hoc retrofits slapped onto older houses. Increasingly, to many, home. The unofficial term was bomb shelter. Target was at minus 35 degrees, minus 39 degrees. Tactical laid crosshairs onto her the moment she passed into view. Same civilian disguise, same visor. But something had happened to Lenny Clark since Calgary. She favored one leg when she walked. A yellow bruise spilled across the right side of her face. Perrault tripped the fly's speaker, thought twice, shut it off again. No need to draw unnecessary attention. Instead, she brought up the comm menu, got a lock on. Ooh, excuse me. Oh. Instead, she brought up the comm menu, got a lock on Clark's visor, and tapped into the RF. Hi, it's Sue Han again. Down on the floor, Lenny Clark froze. She brought her wrist up. She was no longer wearing a watch. Up here, Perrault said, in the botfly. A proximity alert bleeped in her face. Another fly coming into range. Perrault spun, caught it arriving through the fly-sized cat flap. Oh my gosh. Perrault spun, caught it arriving through the fly-sized cat flap 2 meters over the main entrance. Even in visible light, the weapons muzzles were obvious. She looked back down. Clark was gone. Perrault panned until the crosshairs came up again. The Rifter was heading for the door, glancing up at the other fly. It didn't notice her. It was heading toward the bloody Rorschach blot at the other end of the cave. Not that one, Perrault said. Me, the little one, the surveil... You're the stalker, right? Clark broke in. Yeah, that's what you called me anyway. Bye. She was at the entrance. Wait! Gone. Perrault spared another look at the other botfly. It was hovering over the aftermath of the fight, its cameras pointing straight down. It had probably been summoned by the fly Perrault was riding, just before she'd grabbed the keys. It wasn't paying any attention to her. If its rider even knew that Perrault was in command, he or she didn't seem to care. Nothing much I can do either way, she thought, and dived through the flytrap. As in botfly trap door is my assumption. He does a Peter Watts does a lot of that, particularly in this series. There's a bunch of it in Blindsight and Echopraxia, but it seemed more obvious in most cases, less contextual. Whereas this is very contextual. Like, there's some jargon and nicknames for things used in this that you won't really figure out the first time through until later in the book where you're like, oh, okay, it's a world where there's a lot of these robot flies flying around, blah 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 blah. So what do you need? You need trapdoors for them. Well, they call them cat flaps, but they're trapdoors for the flies, so fly trap, that sort of thing. It makes sense in context. Thin, dirty rain, sparse droplets blown sideways. The sky was brown. The air seemed full of grit. Farther south, then, someplace where it probably hadn't really snowed in years. A metropolitan skyline hovered behind the dome like a murky histogram. Four-lane blacktop stretched out from that background, bled a puddle of asphalt beside the shelter, and continued to the horizon. On all sides a threadbare weave of smaller roads, some little more than dirt paths, extended through a patchwork of fields and woodlots. Target, pinned and highlighted like a luminous butterfly, was moving away along one of them. Still no GPS. Even the compass was offline. Perrault reacquired the Rifter's visor and set off on her trail. Listen, I can... Fuck off. Last time you were in one of those things it ended up shooting at me. That wasn't me. The link went down. Yeah? Clark didn't look back. And what's going to keep it up this time? This fly doesn't have any weapons. It's strictly eyes and ears. I don't like eyes and ears. It couldn't hurt to have an extra set on your side. If I'd been around to do some advanced scouting before, maybe you wouldn't have that bruise on your face. Clark stopped. Perrault brought the fly down and hovered a couple of meters off her shoulder. And when your friends get bored, the Rifter asked, when the link goes down again? I don't know. Maybe the fly just goes back to its regular rounds. At least it can't shoot at you. It can talk to things that can. Look, I'll keep my distance, Perot offered. A couple of 100 meters, say. I'll stay in range of your visor, but if this thing comes to its senses, you'll just be some nameless K who happened to be around when the link came back. They won't look twice. 2 meters off the port bow, Clark's shoulders rose and fell. Why are you doing this? She asked. Why is it so important to help me out? Perot briefly considered telling the truth. I don't know, she said at last. It just is. The rifter shook her head. After a moment, she said, I'm headed south. South? Perot tapped again at the dead compass icon. Nothing. She tried to get a fix on the sun through murky overcast. Clark began walking. This way, she said, and still didn't look back. Perot kept well off the road, paralleling Clark's direction of travel. She called up the camera menu, planning to set a zoom reflex on any motion not consistent with wind action, and was surprised to be offered a choice of views. The Fly had lateral, stern, and ventral cams, as well as the primary stereos up front. She could split the display into 4 windows and keep simultaneous watch on the whole 360. Lenny Clark trudged silently along the road, shoulders hunched against the wind. Her windbreaker flapped against her body like torn plastic. Aren't you cold? Perot asked. Got my skin on. You're, of course, her dive suit. Is this how you always get around? You were the one that warned me off flying. Well, yes, but I bus sometimes, Clark said. Hitchhike. Things that didn't involve ID checks or body scans. There was an irony buried in there, Perot reflected. Clark had probably been through more rigorous security in the past few weeks than would have been imaginable just decades earlier. But modern checks and gauntlets were aimed at pathogens, not people. Who cared about artifacts like personal ID anymore? Who cared about anything so arbitrary as a political border? National identity was so irrelevant that nobody'd even bothered to dismantle it. What a wonderful world. You're not going to find a ride on this road anytime soon, Perot remarked. You should have stuck with the main drag. I like walking alone. Avoids pointless small talk. Perot took the hint. She accessed the botfly's flight recorder, fearful of just how much incriminating information the device had stored. But its entire memory had been purged, an act of sabotage well beyond Perot's capabilities. Even now, the black box somehow failed to retain the routine data stream the fly's sensors were sending it. She was relieved, but not particularly surprised. Still there? Clark said. Uh-huh, link's still up. They're getting better with practice. Perot remembered Clark's reflexive glance at her bare wrist back in the dome. What happened to your watch? Smashed it. Why? Your friends figured out how to override the off switch. They're not friends, not even contacts. She didn't know what they were. And now you're getting in through my visor. If I had any brains, I'd lose that, too. So others have made contact? Of course they had. Why would Suhan Perot be the only person in the world to be given audience with the meltdown Madonna? All right, I forgot, the mermaid said wryly. You don't know anything. Have they? Others like me? Worse, Clark said, and kept walking. Don't push it. A stand of skeletal birch separated them for a few minutes. The port camera caught Lenny Clark in fragments, through a vertical jumble of white slashes. I went into Maelstrom, she said. People are talking about me. Yeah, I know. Do you believe it? The stuff they're saying? Perot tried for a light touch, not believing it herself. So you're not carrying the end of the world around inside of you? If I am, Clark said, it doesn't show up on a blood panel. You can't believe most of the stuff you read in Maelstrom anyway, Perot said. Half of it contradicts the other half. It's all just crazy. I don't know how it got started. A few seconds of silence. Then, I saw someone that looked like me the other day. I told you, you've got friends. No, it's not me you want. It's something in the wires. It just stole my name for some reason. Beep! A sudden luminous triangle, framing a flicker of motion. The stern camera zoomed reflexively. Hold on, Perot said. I've got a... Lenny. What? You might want to get off the road. I think that's a psycho from the shelter. I think it's that psycho from the shelter. It was. Hunched over the handlebars of an ancient mountain bike, he resolved in the zoom window like a grainy nightmare. He pumped, straining, all his weight on the pedals. The vehicle had no seat. It didn't have any tires either. It rattled along the road on bare rims. It was a skeleton ridden by a monster. The monster's jacket was dark and wet, and missing one sleeve. It was not the one he'd been wearing before. He kept his eyes on the road. Only once did he spare a glance back over his shoulder. Eventually, he faded in the murk. Lenny? Here. She rose from a drainage ditch. He's gone, Perot said. The things you see when you don't have your gun, asshole. No worse than anyone else back there. Clark climbed back onto the road. Except for the fact that he beat someone to death. And 100 people stood around and watched. Or didn't you notice? Well, people do that, you know. Just stand around and do nothing. They're fucking complicit. They're no better than... They're worse. At least he took a little initiative. I didn't notice you standing up to him, Perot snapped, and instantly regretted her own defensiveness. Clark turned to face the botfly and said nothing. After a moment, she resumed walking. They're not all complicit, Lenny, Perot said more gently. People want to act. They're just afraid. And sometimes experience teaches you that the only way to cope is to just shut down. Oh, yeah, we're all just victims of our past. Don't you dare trot out that subroutine. What subroutine? The poor little abuse victim. You don't know. You know what abuse is, really? Whoops. I'm going to take that from the top. The poor little abuse victim. You know what abuse is, really? It's an excuse. Lenny, I'm not. So some asshole grabs your cunt in daycare. So someone rams his cock up your ass. So what? Bruises, maybe. A bit of bleeding. You suffer more injury if you fall off the swings and break your arm. So how come you don't hear anyone wailing about abuse then? 1,000 kilometers away, Perot reeled in the surge of Clark's vehemence. I didn't say... And anyway, the physical injury is only part of it. The emotional damage... Crap. You think we aren't built to withstand a little childhood trauma? You know how many of the higher mammals eat their own young? We wouldn't have lasted 10 generations if a couple of childhood shit-kickings was enough to take us out for the count. Lenny, you think all those armies and gangs and cops would be so keen on rape if we just didn't make such a big deal about it? If we didn't get all weak-kneed and trembly at the thought of being violated? Fuck that. I've been attacked by things straight out of nightmares. I've nearly been boiled and buried alive more times than I can count. I know all the ways you can push a body to the breaking point, and sexual abuse doesn't even make the top 10. She stopped and glared across at Perot's distant teleop. Perot zoomed. The rifter was shaking.
Or do you have some basis for disagreement, some personal experience to back up all your trendy platitudes? Sure I had experience. I watched. For years I watched and felt nothing. It was my job.
But of course she couldn't say that.
I No, not really. Course not. You're just a fucking tourist, aren't you? You're safe and comfy in some glass tower somewhere, and you stick a periscope into the real world every now and then and tell yourself you're experiencing life or some such shit. You're pathetic. Lenny, stop feeding off me.
She wouldn't say anything more. She stalked silently along that road in the dirty rain, refusing entreaty or apology. Brown sky faded to black. Visible light failed. Infra kicked in. Lenny Clark was a white-hot speck of anger at fixed range, endlessly moving. In all that time, she only spoke once. The words were barely more than a growl, and Suhan Perot did not believe they were intended for her ears. But the fly's enhanced senses had little regard for range and none for privacy. Filter and gain turned Clark's words from distant static to an ugly, unmistakable truth.
Everybody pays.
Vision Quest. There were two reasons Achilles Desjardins didn't indulge in sex with real partners. The second was simulations gave him much more latitude. Oh, right, unpleasantness. Fair warning, unpleasantness again. What Achilles is into is pretty unpleasant. His system was more than enough to handle the range. His skin came equipped with the latest Lorentz levitation haptics, their formless magnetic fingers both sensing his movements and responding to them. The ad specs boasted you could feel a virtual ant crawling up your back. They weren't lying. The only way you'd get a better ride was to go with a direct neural interface, but Desjardins wasn't about to go that far. It wasn't widely known, but there were creatures in Maelstrom that were learning to penetrate wetware. The last thing he needed was some sourced shark hijacking his spinal cord. And there were other dangers if you went with a wet link, dangers especially relevant to those with Desjardins' tastes. There were still people out there who refused to recognize the difference between reality and simulation, between fantasy and assault. Some of them were savvy enough to hack the things they found politically objectionable. Take the present scenario. It was a pretty sweet setup, all told. He had two girls strapped face down on the table in front of him. One of them was hooked up to a DC power supply by alligator clips on her nipples and clit. The other had to be content with lower tech forms of punishment, which Desjardins was currently administering with an unfinished broom handle. Three others hung inverted against the far wall, passing time until their own numbers came up. It was exactly this sort of environment that certain disagreeable types took pleasure in messing with. Desjardins knew of more than one occasion in which the victims of similar scenarios had miraculously freed themselves from their restraints, coming after the user with steak knives and hedge clippers. Incompetent but enthusiastic neutering generally followed. In at least one case, the emergency interrupt had been overridden, keeping the player on the board right up to the final curtain call. Such things were more than enough of a damper in a feedback skin. If you got nailed through a neural link, you could end up impotent for life. Which was, of course, the whole idea. Achilles Desjardins was more cognizant of the risks than most. He took, therefore, more precautions than most. His sensorium was strictly standalone, with no physical connection to any kind of network. He'd lobotomized the graphics circuitry to reduce its vulnerability to wildlife. It could only present chunky, low-res images that would drive any normal connoisseur crazy, but Desjardins' own wetware more than made up the difference. The pattern matching enhancements in his visual cortex interpolated those crude pixels into a subjective panorama crisp enough to leave the most jaded wirehead drooling. The scenarios themselves were scrubbed and disinfected right down to the texture maps. Desjardins carried way more than his weight in this cesspool of a world. No way was some Twensen Puritan going to mess up any of his well-deserved moments with Mr. Bone. Which made the sudden and complete failure of his system extremely disquieting. There was a brief, sharp prick in his neck, and the whole environment just disappeared. He floated there a moment, a stunned and disembodied being in an imperceptible void. No sounds, no smells or tactile feedback, no vision, not even blackness, really. Not like a window gone dark, not like closing your eyes. More like not having any eyes to begin with. You don't see blackness out of the back of your skull. After all, you don't. Fuck, he thought. They got in. Any second now, everything's going to come back online and they'll be spit roasting me on a pole or something. He tried to flex his fingers around the interrupt. He didn't seem to have any fingers. All his senses remained offline. For a moment, he thought he might get off easy. Maybe they hadn't infected his program. Maybe they'd just crashed it. It made sense. It was always easier to kill a system than subvert it. To kill a system than subvert it. But they shouldn't have been able to do either, for fuck's sake. And why can't I feel anything?
Hello? Hello? This thing on?
What?
Sorry, small attempt at humor. I'm going to ask you a few questions, Achilles. I want you to think long and hard about the answers.
The voice hung there in the void with him, sexless and innocent of ambiance. No reverb, no quiet hum of nearby appliances, no background noise at all. It was almost like a Haven voice, but even that seemed wrong. I want you to think about the ocean, the very deep ocean. Think about some of the things that live down there, the microbes especially. Think about them. He tried to speak. No vocal cords. Good. Now I want you to listen to some names. You may recognize some of them. Abigail McHugh. He'd never heard of her. Donald Lertzman. Lertzman? How's he involved? Wolfgang Schmidt. Judy Caraco. Is this some kind of corpse loyalty test? Oh, Jesus. That Haven contact. Pickering's pile. It said it could find me. Andre Bro. Patricia Rowan. Lenny Clark. Rowan! She behind this? Ken Lubin. Leo Hintan III. Mark Scholl. Michael Brander. Yeah, Rowan. Maybe Alice isn't so paranoid after all. Good. Now I want you to think about biochemistry. Proteins. Sulfur-containing amino acids. What follows is question mark, exclamation point, question mark, ellipsis. In the words of Frank Zappa, make a jazz noise here. Oh, thanks for tuning in, Warren. I can tell you're confused. Let's narrow it down some. Cysteine, methionine, methionine. Think about those when you hear the following words. It's a mind-reading trick of some kind, Desjardins thought. Retrovirus, stereoisomer, sarcomere. A quantum computer? They didn't exist. Of course, that was the official story on most banned technology, but in this case Desjardins was inclined to believe it. Nobody in their right mind would be caught dead around a telepathic AI. That had been one side effect the Q boosters hadn't seen coming. The whole quantum consciousness debate had been resolved overnight.
Who'd ever choose to build something that could sift through their minds like a chess grandmaster noodling around in a game of X's and O's?
Nobody, as far as Desjardins had been able to tell.
Ion pump, thermophile. But if not a quantum computer, then archaea, phenylidol.
I have no idea what that is. Phenylindole.
Gansfeld. Not a computer, except for the interrogation interface. Not telepathy either. Not quite. Cruder. The faint quantum signals of human consciousness, cut away from the noise and sensory static that usually swamped them. Properly insulated from such interference, you had a better than average chance of guessing what your subject was looking at, or listening to. You could feel the vicarious echo of distant emotions. With the right insulation and the right stimuli, you could learn a lot. So Desjardins had been told. He'd never actually experienced it before. Good. Now think about the assignments you've had at Xira over the past month. Mange de la marde. Just because some disembodied voice told him to think about something didn't mean he had to leap up and, there's a familiar pattern. Here's an exercise for you, Achilles. Whatever you do, do not think of a red-eyed baboon with hemorrhoids. Oh, shit. You see, nothing's more doomed to failure than trying really hard not to think about something. Shall we continue? Think about your Xira assignments for the past 6 months. A red-eyed baboon with think of earthquakes and tidal waves. Think of any possible connections. Isn't this a security breach? Shouldn't Guilt Trip be doing something? Earthquakes. Tidal waves. He couldn't keep them out. Maybe it is. Maybe Trip seized up my whole body. If I even still have a body, how would I know? Fires. Oh, Jesus, I'll give everything away. Threads of emerald light lancing through the fog. Think of containment protocols. Think of collateral damage. Stop it, stop it. Did you plan it? No, no, Did you know in advance? How could I? They don't tell me any.
Incidentally, every time I speak as Desjardins, it's his thoughts. He is not actually talking.
Did you find out afterward? If Trip's working, my body's already dead. Oh, motherfucking blood-spewing sickle-celled savior! Did you approve? What kind of stupid question is that? Nothing for a very long time. I feel awful, Desjardins thought. Then, hey, despair, guilt, fear, chemicals, all. Hormones and neurotransmitters, a medley brewed not just in the brain, but in glands throughout the body. The physical body. I'm still alive. I've still got a body even if I can't feel it. Let's talk about you, said the voice at last. How have you been lately, health-wise? Have you had any cuts or injuries? Anything to break the skin? I'm feeling a bit better, thank you. Any symptoms of illness? Any inoculations within the past 2 weeks? Blood tests? Unusual reactions to recreational transderms? Real sexual experiences? Never. I'd never inflict that on a person. Silence. Hey, you there? With a blinding flash and a roar like an angry ocean, the real world crashed in from all sides. After a while, everything desaturated to normal intensity. He stared up at his living room ceiling and waited while a cacophony of ambient sounds faded down to a single rhythmic scrubbing. Someone's in here. He tried to rise. A sharp pain in his neck kept him from any sudden moves, but he managed to get erect and stay that way.
In only the most innocent sense, unfortunately. His feedback skin was folded neatly to one side. He was completely naked. The scrubbing sound was coming from the bathroom. He didn't have any weapons. At this point, he didn't think he needed any. If the intruder had meant to kill him, he'd be dead already. Desjardins stepped tentatively toward the hallway and nearly took a header into the wall. Mandelbrot, true to form, had gotten his way and tried the classic feline figure eight around the legs takedown. As they do. Desjardins spared a silent curse and crept toward the bathroom. Someone was standing at the sink without any pants on. Seen from the back, medium height, but built like a Ballard stack. Dark hair, flecked with gray, navy cable knit sweater, black underwear, little scars all over the backs of the legs. Bare feet. His pants were draped along the counter. He was scrubbing at one leg in the sink. Your cat pissed on me, he said without turning. Desjardins shook his head. His neck reminded him of the stupidity of that gesture. What? When we had our session, the stranger said. Desjardins glanced in the mirror, but the man's face was tilted down, intent on his task. I assume someone in your position knows about Gansfeld techniques? I've heard of them, Desjardins said. Then you know you have to minimize extraneous signal. Nerve blocks on all the main sensory cables. Everything. I was just as disconnected as you. But you were talking. The intruder nudged a small beige fanny pack on the floor with his foot. That was talking. I just set up the dialogue tree. Anyway, he straightened, his back still to the door. Your stupid cat pissed on my leg when I was laid out. Good for my stupid cat, Desjardins didn't say. I thought only dogs were supposed to do that. Desjardins shrugged. Mandelbrot's kind of a mutant. The intruder grunted and turned. He wasn't exactly ugly, more like what would result if someone with limited artisan skills carved a human face in a totem pole. It might not run to your taste, but there was no denying a certain crude aesthetic. More tiny scars on the face. Still, not quite ugly. Scary, though. That fit. Desjardins didn't know exactly what it was that made him think that. You're immune to guilt trip, the intruder told him. Want to guess how that happened? The algebra of guilt. The naked lawbreaker was watching him with wary curiosity. Not much actual fear, Lubin noted. When you routinely juggled thousands of lives for a living, you probably figured that other people were the ones with cause to worry. Sudbury was a safe, law-abiding place. Wielding his godlike control over the real world, Desjardins had probably forgotten what it was like to actually live in it. Who are you? Desjardins asked. Name's Colin, Lubin said. Uh-huh. And why does Rowan have such a hard-on for testing my loyalty? Maybe you didn't hear me, Lubin said. You're immune to guilt trip. I heard you. I just think you're full of shit. Really? Lubin laid the slightest emphasis on the word. Nice try, Colin, but I kind of keep up on that stuff. I see. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's indestructible. I can think of a few commercial enzymes that break it down just off the top of my head. The right kind of reuptake inhibitor blockers could do the job too, I'm told. That's why they have these tests, you see. That's why I can barely go 2 days without some bloodhound sniffing my crotch. Believe me, if I was immune to guilt trip, I'd already know it, and so would every security database up to GeoSync. And you know, the really odd thing about this is that Rowan must know that already. He never had a chance to move. Lubin was behind him in the space of a syllable, had one arm locked around his throat in two. The long, curved needle in his other hand tickled Desjardins' eardrum suggestively. You have 3 seconds to tell me what it's called, Lubin whispered, relaxing his grip just enough to permit some semblance of speech.
Behemoth!
Desjardins gasped. Lubin tightened his grip again. Place of origin, 2 seconds. Relaxed it.
Deep sea! Juan de Fuca! Chattervent, I think!
Worst case scenario, 1.
Everything dies, for fuck's sake! Everything just fades away!
Lubin let him go. Desjardins staggered forward against the sink, gulping air. Lubin could see his face reflected in the mirror, panic subsiding, the higher brain kicking in, reassessment of threat potential, dawning awareness of 3 breaches he'd just committed. 3 violations when guilt trip should have risen from within and throttled him even more tightly than Lubin just had. Achilles Desjardins turned and faced Lubin with horror and fear spreading across his face.
Maudite merde!
I told you, Lubin said. You're a free agent. Vive le gardien libre.
How'd you do it?
Desjardins slumped morosely on the couch next to his clothes.
More to the point, why? The next time I show up for work, I'm screwed. Rowan knows that. What's she trying to prove?
I'm not here for Rowan, Lubin said. Rowan's the problem, in fact. I'm here on behalf of her superiors.
Yeah?
Desjardins actually seemed to approve of that. Not surprising. Patricia Rowan had never exactly endeared herself to the lower ranks. There are concerns that some of the information we've received from her office has been tainted, Lubin continued. I'm here to cut out the middleman and get the unadulterated truth. You're going to help me.
And I'm not much good to you if my brain seizes up every time you ask a touchy question.
Yes. Desjardins began getting dressed.
Why not just go through channels? GT won't raise a peep if I know the orders are coming from higher up the food chain.
Rowan would peep.
Oh, right.
Desjardins pulled his shirt on over his head.
So tell me if I've got this down. You ask me a bunch of questions, and if I don't answer them to the best of my ability, you stick a needle in my ear. If I do, you let me go, and the next time I go to work, I set off more sirens than I can count. They take me apart piece by piece to find out what went wrong, and if I'm very lucky, they'll just throw me onto the street as a security risk. Is that about right?
Not exactly, Lubin said.
What then?
I'm not the snuff fairy, Lubin said. In fact, that was exactly what someone had called him nearly 2 years before. I don't leap gaily from door to door, killing people for no good reason. And you're going to do more than answer a few questions for me. You're going to take me to work and show me your files.
Not after.
Lubin held up a derm between thumb and forefinger. Trip analog. Short-lived and fairly inert, but it looks pretty much the same to a bloodhound. Stick it under your tongue 15 minutes before getting to work and you'll pass the tests. If you cooperate, no one will know the difference.
Until you bugger off and take your analog with you.
You're forgetting how guilt trip works, Desjardins. Your own cells are producing the stuff. I haven't stopped that. I've just dosed you with something to break down the finished product before it hits your motor nerves. Eventually, it'll get used up, and you'll be a happy little slave again.
How long?
Week or 10 days. Depends on individual metabolism. Even if I do bugger off, you could always just call in sick until it wears off.
I can't, and you know it. I got my immunes boosted when I joined the patrol. I'm even immune to supercall.
I think that might be super cholera, but there's no H, so I don't know. It's just super COL. I don't know. Lubin shrugged. Then you'll just have to trust me. In fact, it had been lies from the word go. Lubin had not freed Achilles Desjardins. He'd merely stumbled on the discovery as they both lay on the floor, disconnected from themselves and strangely linked to each other through a mechanical interrogator. The derm he'd presented had been an acetylcholine booster, a memory aid one step removed from candy. His words had been spun on the fly, woven around the lawbreaker's reactions in the Gansfeld. Rowan, yes, strong reaction there. No reaction to Rifter names, but horror and recognition at the thought of earthquakes and tidal waves and mysterious fires. Desjardins had pursued the truth, and recoiled from it. He had not set any of the larger wheels in motion. As far as Lubin could tell, he didn't even know how many wheels there were. He hadn't known that he was immune to guilt trip either. That was especially interesting. Desjardins had been right. It would be impossible to avoid one of Xira's spot checks for more than a day or two. So, barring the unlikely possibility that Desjardins had acquired his immunity within the past few hours, his body had done a lot more than throw off GT. It had managed to hide that fact from the bloodhounds. Lubin had not realized that freedom from guilt trip was possible. It raised certain prospects he had not previously considered. And this next chapter will be the last one, and yet another fair warning. It is also fairly nasty. Lenny Clark has a real mad on at this point and is willing to do just about any unbelievably horrible thing you can imagine uh, in her own particular wonderful way. The chapter is entitled Starfucker. Mark Quammen was primed and ready. Tornado season was just winding down in the Dust Belt. 3 solid months of flywheel repairs had fed the chip in his thigh until it was 6 digits fat, and he had a month until spring runoff started clogging the dams up north. Options were tempting and plentiful in the meantime. He could boost his chloroplasts to UV shield levels and bugger off to the Carolinas. He could check out the underwater Club Med over in Hatteras. He'd heard they'd walled off a whole bay with this big semi-permeable membrane, let the ocean in but kept out all those nasty synthetic macromolecules and heavy metals. Their cultured coral had finally taken off. It might even be open to the tourists by now. That would be something to see. There hadn't been wild coral anywhere in Enum since Key West had packed it in. Of course, these days there were all sorts of nasty things waiting to jump on you when you ventured outside. That new bug the left coast refugees had brought over, for instance, the all-purpose number that killed you a dozen different ways. Maybe it'd be better just to stay in this dark, cozy little booth in this dark, cozy little drinkin' drug at the edge of the belt, and let breakthroughs in brain chem provide him a richness of experience he could never get in the real world. That was pretty tempting, too. Plus, he could start immediately. Already had started, in fact. Quammen stretched and settled deeper into his cushioned alcove and watched the local butterflies sparkling at each other. Upstairs, the world was a salt-baked oven. If you were an unprotected eyeball out there, the only question was whether you'd go salt-blind before the wind sandblasted you down to pitted gelatin. In here, though, it was always dark, and the air barely moved. He felt like a cat in a nook in a dark green cave, surveying a subterranean domain. There was a little blonde K selector sitting alone at the bar. Quammen absently stuck a derm behind his ear and aimed his watch at her. Passive infrared and a few ultrasonic squeaks, barely audible even to bats, bounced back and forth. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were a flat and startling ivory. She started toward him. He didn't know her. Quammen's watch flashed him an executive summary. She wasn't horny either. He couldn't think of any other reason she'd approach him, though. She stopped just outside the alcove, a hint of a smile beneath those strange, blank eyes. "Nice effect," Quammen said, seizing the initiative. "You see an X-ray with those things?"
So what was that?
"What was what?"
You zapped me with something.
Oh! Quammen raised his hand, let her see the whisper-thin filament extending from his watch. You got some kind of sensor on you? She shook her head. Thin lips, small tits, great hips. Sharp edges, just slightly smoothed, like a perfect little ice sculpture left a minute too long in the sun. So how'd you know? Quammen asked.
I felt it.
Bullshit. The IR's passive. The sonar's real weak.
I've got an implant, said the K. Hard stuff. You can feel it when the sound hits.
Implant? This could be interesting.
Yeah. So, what are you doing here?
Quammen sneaked another peek at his watch. No, she wasn't on the prowl. Hadn't been a minute ago, anyway. Maybe that was open to negotiation. Maybe it had already changed. He wanted to scope her out again, but he didn't want to give himself away. Shit. Why'd she have to be sensitive to probes?
I said,
Just coming off a nice fat contract, he told her. Riding flywheels. Figuring out my next move. She slid in beside him, grabbed a derm from the table, dispenser.
tell me about it.
She was fucking cryptic, was what she was. Or maybe just old-fashioned. She hadn't propositioned him outright, which was a drag. It wasted time. Quammen would have propositioned her in an instant, but unless his plug-in was wrecked, she hadn't been receptive at first, and that probably meant he was going to have to work at it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had to rely on instinct, of all things, to know whether a woman was interested or not, and this Lenny wasn't making things any easier. A couple of times he'd put a hand here or there, and she'd literally flinched. But then she'd run a finger down his arm or tap the back of his hand, and just generally came on as wet as a hagfish. If she wasn't interested, why was she wasting his time? Was she really here for the conversation? By the third derm, it didn't seem to matter so much. You know what I am? Quammen demanded. An influx of exogenous transmitters had made him suddenly eloquent. I'm a fucking crusader is what I am. It is my personal mission to save the world from the Quebecois. She blinked lazily over her alien eyes.
Too late, she said.
You know, only 50 years ago, people paid less than a third of their disposable income on energy? Less than a third?
I did not know that, Lenny answered.
And the world's ending. It's ending right now.
That, Lenny said, I did know.
Do you know when? Do you know when the end began?
Last August.
2035, the onset of adaptive shatter, when damage control started accounting for more of the GGP than the production of new goods.
Damage control?
Damage control! He pounded the table for emphasis. Oh! My whole life is damage control. I fix the things that entropy breaks. Things fall apart, Lenny Molass. The only way you can stop the slide is throw energy at it. That's the only way we got from primordial slime to human slime. Evolution would be sockeye without the sun to lean on.
Oh, there are places where evolution didn't need the sun.
Yeah, but you get my point. The more complicated a system gets, the more fragile it is. All that eco-babble about diversity promotes stability, that's pure bullshit. You take your coral reef or your tropical rainforest, those things were starved for energy. You've got so many species, so many energy pathways using up resources that there's hardly a spare erg left over. Drive through a rainforest with a bulldozer or two and tell me how stable that system ends up being.
Oops, Lenny said. Too late.
Quammen barely heard her.
Now, what we've got here is a system that's so complicated, it makes a tropical rainforest look like a fucking monoculture. Everything gets way too complicated for mere mortals, so we set up webs and networks and AIs to keep track of things. Except they end up exploding into these huge cancers of complexity too. So that only makes the problem worse. And of course now all the underlying infrastructure is breaking down. The weather and the biosphere are all fucked up. So not only do we need oodles more energy to keep this huge wobbling gyro from crashing over on its side, but those same factors keep knocking out the systems we put in place to produce all that extra energy. You see what I'm saying? You know what apocalypse is? It's a positive feedback loop. So why blame Quebec for all this? They're the only ones who got their asses in gear fast enough to save anything. It was the Hydro Wars that...
Here it comes. Quebec was gonna save the world, and if only we hadn't ganged up on the frogs, we'd all be sipping neuro cocktails on a beach somewhere, and Maelstrom would be nice and clean and bug-free and... don't get me started.
Too late for that, too.
Hey, I'm not saying the war didn't kick Maelstrom past critical mass. Maybe it did. But it would have happened anyway. 5 years, tops. And do you really think the frogs had any more foresight than the rest of us? They just lucked out with their geography. Anyone could make the world's biggest hydro facility if they had all of Hudson Bay to dam up. And who was going to stop them? The Cree tried, and you know that? And you know what? The Cree tried, did you know that? Remember the Cree? A few thousand malcontents up around James Bay, just before that nasty and unfortunate plague that only killed abos. And after that went down, Nunavut just rolled over and did what they were told. And the rest of fucking Canada was still so busy trying to lure the frogs back in the bed, they were willing to look the other way over pretty much anything. And now it's too late, and the rest of us run around playing catch up with our wind farms and our photosynthesis arrays and our deep sea geothermal.
Incidentally, this chapter is also the massive, massive background lore exposition dump chapter. It's shoehorned in there, but he did it. While also having a horrible, horrible end. Lenny's eyes floated in front of him. Something clicked in Quammen's head.
Hey,
he said after a moment, are you, She grabbed his wrist and pulled him out of the alcove.
Enough of this bullshit. Let's fuck.
And now the really unpleasant part kicks in. It's not as unpleasant as the last one, but it's pretty bad. Because Lenny's not really all there right now. She is not exactly thinking, thinking in a kind or empathic fashion at this point.
She is, it turns out, one sick puppy.
She was something else. She had seams in her chest and a perforated metal disc poking out between her ribs. She told him, around mouthfuls of cock, that a childhood injury had left her with a prosthetic lung. It was an obvious lie, but he didn't call her on it. Everything was making sense now, right down to the way she kept freezing up and trying to hide it, the way she acted hot to cover how cold she was. She was a rifter. Quammen had heard about them. Hell, they were the competition. Enumpak had sent them down to hydrothermal vents all over the eastern Pacific, until word got out that they were all completely fucked in the head. Something about abuse survivors being best suited for risky deep-sea work. Some reducto-mechanist shit like that. Reducto-mechanist shit like that. It was no wonder Lenny wasn't keen on sharing her life story. Quammen wasn't going to push her on it. Besides, the sex was pretty good. The occasional flinch notwithstanding, she seemed to know exactly what to do. Quammen had heard the usual rumors, the wisdom of the old ones, he liked to call them. If you want good sex, find an abuse victim. Didn't quite seem right to put something like that to the test, but after all, she'd been the one to take the lead. And what do you know? The old ones spake the truth. He fucked her so hard his cock came out bloody. He frowned, sudden concern wilting him like a stalk of old celery. Whoa! She just smiled.
Is that you? Are you hurt? Is it... Oh, crap. Is it me?
I'm an old-fashioned girl, she said, looking up at him.
What do you mean? Surely he'd have felt it if something had cut his cock.
I menstruate.
You... You're kidding.
Why would anyone choose to...
I mean, that's really Twensen.
He stood and reached for a towel on the dresser.
You could have told me, he said, wiping at himself.
Sorry, she said.
Well, pick your own pleasure by all means, Quammen said. It's no big deal. I just thought...
She'd left her pack unzipped on the floor beside the dresser. Something glinted wet and dark from inside. He leaned slightly for a better view.
Ah, he said. Sorry if I...
A utility clip, blade extended. Used.
Sure, she said behind him. Fine.
She cut herself. Before we fucked. Must have been when I was in the bathroom. She cut her own insides.
He turned back to the bed. Lenny was already half dressed. Her face was a blank mask. It framed her eyes perfectly. She noticed his gaze. She smiled again. Mark Quammen felt a tiny chill.
Nice meeting you, she said. Go and sin some more.
And with that, we're going to call it. That's, I think, the worst of it. There is some unpleasantness towards the end. But that's most of Lenny Clark acts out in her own particular way, being the meltdown Madonna. So I can't remember if this is explained or not, but in hindsight, it's very obvious. So Lenny Clark has twigged to the fact that she probably has a pretty nasty communicable disease in her, and she is taking it upon herself to spread the shit out of it. And she's doing that by finding people and having sex with them. Because she's a nut bar. And she has a lot of self-hate and a lot of other horrible, horrible things. So that's the worst of it. The bit in the middle is definitely the worst by far. We're going to have some unpleasantness with some other characters later, but for now, that's most of the bad stuff. Very lurid stuff, I should say, or graphic stuff. With that, I'm going to call it. Thanks to everyone who tuned in, to everyone watching this after the fact. Hi! I do this live every Friday on Free Read Fridays, and starting around 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. That may be changing in the eventual future, but I'll at least make that known when that change is going to occur, so people can adjust accordingly. I do have other streams throughout the week. I've got a Mecha Mondays stream where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent, and a Warframe Wednesdays stream where I do Warframe for a couple hours. But then this Free Read Fridays is definitely my favorite of the lot. Sorry, I have favorites. It's the one I actually put effort into. Cough, cough. Mostly because I have to talk nonstop for 2 hours. All right, with that, I'm going to run. Thanks again for tuning in. Stay safe, stay sane. Stay toasty or cool as per your preference or hemispherical geolocation, and be decent to each other. All right. See you all later. Bye.